Once upon a time, there was a man named David. David was not always wealthy, but he worked hard to build his fortune. He started with nothing but ambition and determination. Over the years, his hard work paid off, and soon he became a successful businessman. His life was a testament to perseverance and dedication. David had married Emma, a kind and understanding woman, when they were both young. They met in their early 20s, and after a few years of dating, they decided to settle down. Emma was always there for him, supporting his dreams, even when times were tough. She helped him through his struggles and cheered for him during his successes. Together, they built a life that many would envy. They lived in a beautiful home, had 2 children, and seemed to have everything anyone could want. David's business grew rapidly, and with it, his wealth. Their house was big, filled with luxurious furniture and beautiful decorations. Emma kept the home warm and inviting, always making sure their children felt loved and cared for. As time went on, David's success in business allowed him to travel the world. He went to expensive places and met influential people. He wore fine suits and enjoyed the finest meals at the best restaurants. Yet, despite all his wealth, David began to feel that something was missing. The excitement of building his fortune had faded, and he started to crave something new, something different. At home, life with Emma felt comfortable, but in a way, it also felt predictable. The routines of their everyday life no longer sparked the joy and excitement David once felt. He loved his children, but the thrill of business and travel had left him restless. He wanted to experience something fresh and exciting, and that longing started to grow stronger each day. One day, during a business trip, David met a woman named Sophie. She was much younger than him, full of energy, and seemed to bring a sense of adventure wherever she went. Sophie was lively, spontaneous, and unlike anyone David had ever met. Her presence was magnetic, and before long, David found himself drawn to her. They talked for hours, and David felt a rush of excitement that he hadn't felt in years. Sophie made him feel alive again, reminding him of the youth and freedom he had lost while building his empire. It was the excitement he had been seeking. Sophie's attention made David feel important, desired, and powerful in ways he had forgotten. The more he spent time with her, the more he felt that Emma, with her calm and steady love, couldn't give him the adventure he was craving. David found himself at a crossroads. He loved Emma, but Sophie offered him something new, something thrilling. What started as innocent friendship slowly turned into something more. David felt torn between the woman who had stood by his side through thick and thin, and the one who was making him feel a sense of excitement he had been longing for. His decision, one that would change his life forever, began to take shape. David's life took a dramatic turn after meeting Sophie. What began as innocent conversations during business trips soon turned into something more. He found himself thinking about her constantly, wondering if he could find the excitement he was missing in his life with her. Sophie's youthful energy and adventurous spirit made David feel young again. She sparked something inside him that he thought had long been lost. Back home, his life with Emma continued as usual. The routine of work, family dinners, and quiet evenings felt more like a prison to David. The woman he had once loved so deeply now seemed distant, and the life they had built together no longer felt fulfilling. Emma still tried her best to keep their family life running smoothly, but David's heart was no longer in it. David tried to ignore the growing feelings he had for Sophie. He told himself that his life with Emma was too important to throw away over a brief fling. But every time he saw Sophie, the pull between them grew stronger. They continued to meet secretly, sharing intimate conversations and stolen moments of happiness. Sophie made David feel alive in ways he hadn't felt in years. She encouraged him to take risks, to do things he had once dreamed of, but never had the courage to try. Slowly, the excitement that Sophie brought into David's life began to overshadow his responsibilities at home. He started spending more time away from Emma, telling her that work was keeping him busy. He told himself it was just a phase, that he would eventually get over his infatuation with Sophie. But deep down, David knew that he was no longer content in his marriage. One evening, after a long day of business meetings, David made a decision. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine. He had to be true to himself, even if it meant breaking Emma's heart. That night, he sat her down in their living room, the familiar warmth of their home now feeling cold and foreign. His hands trembled as he looked into her eyes, knowing what he had to say. "I've met someone," David began, his voice shaking, "and I think I need to be with her." Emma looked at him in disbelief, her face pale. She had always trusted him, supported him, and loved him with all her heart. The shock in her eyes was enough to pierce David's soul. He had never imagined causing her this kind of pain, but the decision had already been made. Sophie had awakened something inside him that he could no longer ignore. David's heart ached as he watched Emma struggle to comprehend his words. She asked him if there was anything she had done wrong, if she could change. But David had made up his mind. He had convinced himself that his happiness lay with Sophie, not with Emma. Despite the years of shared memories and love, David felt that the excitement of his new relationship was what he truly needed. The next few weeks were a blur. David moved out of their home and into a new apartment, where Sophie eagerly awaited him. His children were confused and upset, but David tried to brush it off, telling himself it was all for the best. He was finally living the life he had always wanted. But as the days passed, David began to realize that the thrill of starting over wasn't everything he had hoped for. There was no going back. And Sophie, though exciting and vibrant, couldn't fill the emptiness that was slowly growing inside him. He wondered if he had made the right choice. David's decision to leave Emma was not an easy one, and the consequences quickly became clear. As the weeks passed after their separation, the weight of his choice began to settle heavily on his shoulders. At first, he had felt free, excited by the possibilities of his new life with Sophie. But the reality of leaving his family behind soon began to hit him. Emma, heartbroken and confused, tried to keep things together for their children. Their two kids, now teenagers, struggled with their father's departure. They had always looked up to David, seeing him as the steady force in their lives. But now, they were left with a painful void. They couldn't understand why their father had chosen to leave, especially for a woman who was so much younger than him. Emma did her best to reassure them that it wasn't their fault, but they couldn't shake the feeling of abandonment. David's children tried to stay in touch with him, but it wasn't the same. They would call or text, but the conversations were awkward and strained. David didn't know how to explain to them why he had made the choice he did. He wanted to be there for them, but his own guilt made it difficult. He had traded the life they all knew for something unknown, and it was starting to feel like a mistake. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed to be the bright light in David's life. She was everything Emma wasn't: young, spontaneous, and full of energy. She never seemed to ask too many questions about his past or his family. Sophie was eager to build a life with David, to travel the world, and experience new adventures together. David threw himself into this new relationship, trying to drown out the growing doubts in his mind. However, the more time he spent with Sophie, the more he began to notice the differences between them. Sophie's carefree attitude and constant desire for excitement started to clash with David's more thoughtful, reflective side. He realized that while Sophie was a lot of fun, she didn't provide the same kind of stability and support that Emma had. Sophie was always looking ahead, never dwelling on the past, while David found himself looking back, wondering if he had made the right decision. Meanwhile, Emma was doing everything she could to hold her family together. She continued to work, take care of the house, and support their children through the emotional turmoil. But deep down, she was struggling. She had always believed in the strength of their marriage, and David's departure felt like a betrayal. She had given him everything: her love, her support, and her loyalty. And now she had to face the reality that it wasn't enough to keep him by her side. As David's new life unfolded, he couldn't help but feel the absence of the family he had left behind. He missed the quiet evenings with Emma, the dinners around the table with his children. They had been a family, strong, supportive, and whole. Now, everything seemed fractured. The excitement of being with Sophie was starting to wear off, and David found himself questioning the choices he had made. The family he had left behind was not as easily replaced as he had thought. David's new life with Sophie was everything he thought he wanted. The excitement, the freedom, and the thrill of starting fresh had made him feel alive again. He no longer had to worry about the responsibilities of his past, no more family obligations or the quiet routine he had with Emma. Now it was just him and Sophie, exploring the world, enjoying each other's company without the constraints of everyday life. They spent their days traveling to new places, dining in fancy restaurants, and meeting new people. Sophie was full of energy, always ready for the next adventure. She introduced David to new experiences, things he had never thought about before. From skydiving to attending lavish parties, Sophie encouraged David to embrace life to the fullest. For a while, he felt as though he was living a dream, far from the life he had left behind. But as the days passed, a strange feeling began to grow inside David. Despite the fun and excitement, something was missing. Sophie's carefree attitude was refreshing, but it also made David feel unsettled. She never talked about the future, and she never looked back. She was all about living in the moment, which was something David struggled with. He found himself missing the stability and depth of his life with Emma. There was something comforting about having a partner who was always there, someone who understood the importance of family and commitment. Sophie never asked about David's past life, and he never spoke much about it. But slowly, David started to realize how much he missed the connections he once had with his children and Emma. He began to feel guilty about how easily he had left them behind. His children, still struggling with the loss of their father, had tried to reach out to him. They sent texts and made calls, but David had always brushed them off, convincing himself that he was doing what was best for himself. One evening, as David sat by the window of their new apartment, watching the sunset, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was alone, even with Sophie by his side. The bright lights of the city outside seemed distant, and for the first time, he realized how empty his life had become. He had built an empire, but he had lost the people who truly mattered. David had told himself that leaving Emma and his children was the right thing to do, that he needed a change. But now, as he looked back, he wondered if he had been selfish. Sophie had brought excitement into his life, but she hadn't brought the deeper connection he had with his family. He missed the laughter around the dinner table, the quiet moments at home, and the sense of belonging that came with being a husband and father. As time went on, David found himself thinking more and more about his children. They had grown up without him, and he realized that the memories of their childhood, of the family they once were slipping away. His heart ached as he thought about them, wondering how they were doing, if they missed him, and if they would ever forgive him for the pain he had caused. Sophie noticed that David was more distant lately, but she didn't understand why. She had never been the type to look back at the past. For her, the present was all that mattered. But for David, the past was becoming harder to ignore. And with each passing day, the guilt of leaving behind the family he had once loved seemed to weigh heavier on his heart. Life had started to feel like it was on a loop for David. Sophie, still full of energy and adventure, continued to bring excitement into his days, but the thrill was beginning to fade. He thought he had made the right choice by leaving Emma, but with each passing day, the emptiness in his heart grew. David began to question everything, his decisions, his past, and his future. The excitement Sophie provided was starting to feel shallow. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. Sophie came to David with surprising news. She was pregnant. At first, David wasn't sure how to react. He hadn't planned for this. He wasn't sure if he was ready to be a father again, especially at his age. Sophie, however, was overjoyed. She had always wanted a family, and now, it seemed, their life together was taking an unexpected turn. The months passed, and the pregnancy progressed. Sophie's excitement was contagious, and David found himself getting caught up in her happiness, though part of him was still unsure. Then the day arrived, and to everyone's shock, Sophie gave birth to quadruplets. David was stunned. Quadruplets, 4 babies at once. It was a rare and unexpected event, and David wasn't sure how to process it. He had gone from being a man without much responsibility to suddenly being a father to 4 children. Sophie was thrilled, of course, but David was overwhelmed. The reality of his new life was sinking in, and it was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. As the days passed, David started to adjust to the chaos of having 4 newborns in the house. Sophie was constantly busy caring for them, and David did his best to help when he could. But the responsibility was heavy, and he realized how much work went into raising children. The once glamorous life of traveling and partying seemed so distant now. David felt as though he had stepped into an entirely new world. But something strange started happening as the babies grew older. David couldn't help but notice how much they resembled him. Their faces, their eyes, even the way they smiled, it was uncanny. At first, David brushed it off, thinking it was just his imagination. But as the quadruplets continued to grow, the resemblance became even more obvious. They looked like him in ways he couldn't ignore. The more David observed them, the more he began to wonder. How could it be that these 4 children, who were Sophie's and his, resembled him so closely? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more to it? David's thoughts began to race. He had always thought his life with Emma was in the past, and he had moved on to a new chapter with Sophie. But now, as he looked at the quadruplets, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of déjà vu. The connection he felt to them was undeniable. And yet, he still couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something more to their arrival than he had first realized. The questions in David's mind only deepened, and he couldn't ignore the unsettling thought that kept creeping in. Why did these children look so much like him? As the weeks went by, David's doubts about the quadruplets began to grow. Sophie was overjoyed with their new family, and David did his best to keep up with the busy life they now had. But something in the back of his mind kept bothering him. The more time he spent with the babies, the more he couldn't ignore the strange feeling that they looked too much like him. At first, it was easy to brush it off. After all, children often resemble their parents. But these babies, 4 of them, all born at once, seemed to have an uncanny likeness to David. Their eyes, their faces, even the way they laughed, it was as if they were little versions of him. He couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong, that this couldn't be just a coincidence. David found himself staring at the babies more often than he expected, studying their features. Each one seemed to have inherited something from him, whether it was the shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile, or the way they held their tiny hands. Sophie, of course, didn't seem to notice anything unusual. She was too caught up in her joy to see what David saw. She was happy and didn't question the way things were. But David couldn't stop thinking about it. The resemblance was so strong that it made him uneasy. He even found himself comparing their features to those of his children with Emma, wondering if there was some kind of connection. It was impossible to ignore, and the more he tried, the more the thought lingered in his mind. One afternoon, as David sat in the living room, watching Sophie care for the quadruplets, the thought hit him like a bolt of lightning. What if the babies weren't just Sophie's and his? What if they had another connection to his past? The idea seemed crazy, but it was the only explanation that made sense. Could it be possible that these children were somehow linked to his first marriage? Could there be some kind of mix-up, or even a secret that Sophie hadn't shared with him? The thought was frightening, but it was the only one that seemed to explain the strange resemblance. David tried to push the thought out of his mind, but it only grew stronger. He began to question everything he had known. Was his new life really as new as he thought? Was there more to the story than he had been told? As the days passed, David found it harder to ignore the truth that was staring him in the face. He couldn't help but wonder if he was missing something important, something that could change everything. The connection between him and the quadruplets was undeniable, and it seemed as though fate had played a trick on him. Sophie, unaware of David's growing doubts, continued to be the loving, carefree mother she had always been. But for David, everything was different now. The babies were no longer just a symbol of his new life with Sophie. They had become a symbol of the confusion and uncertainty that had crept into his world. David knew he needed answers. The questions he had been avoiding were no longer something he could ignore. The resemblance between him and the quadruplets was too strong to be a coincidence. And now he had to find out the truth. David's life had become a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. He couldn't stop thinking about the quadruplets and the strange resemblance they had to him. Despite his attempts to focus on his new life with Sophie, the questions that had started to plague his mind seemed impossible to shake. He knew he had to get to the bottom of this mystery, but how? Then, one day, as if the universe itself was pushing him toward answers, David ran into Emma. It was completely unexpected. He was out for a walk, trying to clear his head, when he saw her standing across the street. For a moment, he stood frozen, unsure of what to do. It had been years since they had spoken, since he had left her behind for Sophie. He wasn't sure how to feel, nervous, guilty, or even relieved. But one thing was certain, he had to talk to her. Emma noticed him standing there and, to his surprise, walked over. She hadn't changed much. She still had the same gentle smile, though it seemed a little sadder now. There was no anger in her eyes, just a quiet acceptance. It felt strange to David to see her again, to be so close after so much time apart. He wasn't sure what to say. The past was so complicated, and he wasn't sure if he even had the right to speak to her after everything he had done. "David," Emma said softly, her voice a little uncertain. "It's been a long time." David nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I never thought I'd run into you like this," he said. I've been thinking a lot about the past lately." Emma gave him a small, understanding smile. "We all do, eventually." David didn't know where to start. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many regrets, so many questions he needed answers to. But before he could speak, Emma looked at him with a steady gaze, as though she had been waiting for him to come to this moment. "How are the kids?" David asked, suddenly feeling the pang of guilt. "I haven't seen them in so long." Emma paused for a moment, a soft sadness crossing her face. "They're growing up. They miss you, David. They've always missed you." Her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable sorrow in it. David felt a lump form in his throat. He had left without looking back, believing that the future with Sophie would be all he needed. But hearing Emma speak so calmly about their children, about how much they still longed for him, made his heart ache. He had abandoned them, and now they were living without him. There was a long silence between them. Neither of them knew exactly what to say next. David's mind raced. He had always thought he made the right decision by leaving, by choosing excitement and adventure over a quiet life. But now, standing here in front of Emma, he realized how wrong he had been. The family he had walked away from, the life he had once known, was not something that could just be replaced. I made a mistake, didn't I?" David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, her expression calm but wise. Finally, she spoke. "It's not for me to say, David, but I think we both know that it's not too late to try and make things right." David nodded, his heart heavy with regret. He wasn't sure how to fix things or if he even could. But one thing was clear, he couldn't keep running from the truth anymore. He had to face it. As they parted ways, David's mind was spinning. The answers he had been searching for seemed so much closer now, but they also felt more complicated than ever. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, and the questions about the quadruplets were still unanswered. But for the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of clarity. He had been running from the past for so long, but now he knew it was time to face it. After his unexpected meeting with Emma, David's thoughts were consumed by everything they had talked about. He had spent so many years running away from the past, but now he was starting to see it all clearly. Emma's words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't ignore the feelings of regret and guilt that flooded him. The connection with his children, the life he had once had, seemed like something he had taken for granted. But there was still something that bothered him, something about the quadruplets. The resemblance between him and the babies was something David couldn't shake. No matter how much he tried to focus on the present, the thought of the quadruplets kept nagging at him. Sophie had always been open about the fact that the babies were his, and David had never questioned it. But now he wasn't so sure. David decided he couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. He needed answers. He had to understand how the quadruplets, who, in every way, looked so much like him, had come to be. Sophie had never seemed to question it, but David couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to the story. One evening, after the babies had gone to bed, David sat down with Sophie. He could see the joy in her eyes whenever she looked at the children. But tonight, he saw a hint of worry on her face as well. Sophie must have sensed that something was different about David's mood. "What's on your mind, David?" she asked softly, sitting next to him. David took a deep breath. It was time to finally ask the question that had been on his mind for so long. "Sophie, I need to know something. I need to understand. How are these babies so much like me?" Sophie looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "They're yours, David. You know that. You saw the tests." David nodded, but he could feel his heart racing. "I know, but something doesn't feel right. The way they look like me. It's not just the usual resemblance. It's too much. I can't explain it, but it's like they were meant to be mine. And that doesn't make sense." Sophie's face softened as she realized what David was getting at. "David," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I've been meaning to tell you something. There's something I never told you about the baby's conception." David's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. "What do you mean?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, then sighed deeply. "Before I met you, I had a procedure done. It was part of an experiment, something to do with genetics. I didn't think it would affect you, but when we met, I never thought it would turn into this. The doctor used a sample from a donor. And David, that donor was you." David's world seemed to stop in that moment. He stared at Sophie, unable to process what she had just said. "You mean to tell me that these babies are mine, but not in the way I thought?" Sophie nodded slowly. "Yes, they are your children, but not in the way you imagined. The procedure used your genetics, but it wasn't a natural conception. I never meant for it to happen like this, but it did." David sat in stunned silence. The truth had hit him like a wave, knocking the breath out of him. The babies, his quadruplets, were his biological children, but there was so much more to the story than he had realized. Sophie had kept this secret from him all along, and now everything made sense. The resemblance, the connection. It was all part of something much bigger than David had ever imagined. But now, as he looked at Sophie, he realized that there was no turning back. The past was complicated, but the future was still ahead of him. And now he had the chance to make things right, not just for himself, but for the children who had unknowingly been a part of his life all along. The truth about the quadruplets' origin weighed heavily on David's heart. For so long, he had questioned their resemblance to him, never fully understanding why they looked so much like him. But now, the secret was out. Sophie had revealed that the babies were his, created through a scientific procedure that involved his own genetics. The shock of the revelation left David feeling numb. The excitement he once felt about the new life he had built with Sophie now seemed distant, overshadowed by this complex new reality. As David sat with Sophie that night, the full weight of the situation began to sink in. The babies were his, but their creation was far from natural. There were so many questions still unanswered. Why had Sophie kept this secret from him for so long? How had he not suspected anything? But there was one thing he knew for certain. These children were his, and no matter how they came into the world, they were now a part of his life. Sophie sat quietly beside him, watching him struggle with his thoughts. She had kept this secret out of fear that David might leave her if he knew the truth. But now, as she watched him wrestle with the reality of it all, she knew that she had made a mistake. She should have told him sooner. But she had also hoped that their love for each other would be enough to overcome any challenges they might face. "David," Sophie said softly, her voice trembling, "I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to protect us." David turned to her, his face filled with a mixture of confusion and sadness. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but the truth was hard to accept. He had left Emma for Sophie, thinking that he was building a fresh, exciting future. Now he realized that his past was never really gone. It had followed him into this new life, in the form of these 4 children. "I don't know what to think right now," David admitted. "I thought I left everything behind when I left Emma. But now, everything's tangled up. These babies, they're mine, but not in the way I thought." Sophie nodded, understanding his pain. "I know it's a lot to take in. But these babies, they need you, David. They're part of you. And I need you too. I never wanted to keep this secret, but I didn't know how to tell you." David's mind raced as he reflected on his past choices. Leaving Emma had been one of the hardest decisions of his life. He had walked away from a family that had loved him. And now, years later, he found himself in an even more complicated situation. He missed his children, the ones he had left behind, and the life he had once known. He wondered if he could ever make things right with them, if they would ever forgive him for the hurt he had caused. As the days went by, David spent more time with the Quadruplets. He saw in them a connection to his past, something that had been missing for so long. It wasn't the adventure he had imagined, nor the excitement he had hoped for, but it was real. It was raw, and it was his. David knew that he couldn't change the past, no matter how much he wished he could. But he also realized that he had the power to shape the future. He could be the father his children needed. He could make amends for the mistakes he had made. The road ahead would be difficult, but David was ready to walk it. For himself, for Sophie, for the Quadruplets, and for the family he had once left behind. The future was uncertain, but David knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to run away anymore.